We have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Scott Atlas, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Scott has had a distinguished career as an MD, as a professor of medicine at Stanford. He has served as healthcare policy advisor to a number of presidential candidates from 2008 to 2016. And since March 2020, Scott has been a leading voice arguing for less draconian measures to navigate the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. This period included a stint as a special advisor to the president and a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force in 2020. He joins us today to talk about his experience in the past 2 years, catalog his best-selling book, A Plague Upon Our House, My Fight at a Trump White House to Stop COVID from Destroying America. If you're a regular audience member of the Salem Center, and you can tell by my inability to speak eloquently and introducing someone, I'm very formal. I'm trying to keep this thing very short in introduction. I don't do long introductions, but today is different, and for 2 reasons. First, the Salem Center is built around the slogan, no solutions, only trade-offs. And once COVID hit, even thinking about in these terms became a sin. Anyone who dares ask questions or questions the merits of the models and assumptions of policies being proposed at the start of the pandemic was viciously attacked, including some of us here in this room. Censorship of ideas became common practice. Scott's courage and perseverance to argue, provide alternative perspectives, question assumptions, seek better evidence, i.e. the basics of the scientific process, regardless of whether he is right or wrong, is to be commendable. Second, on a more personal note, in no small part, Scott's work made my life, my kids, my family, your kids, your families as Texas, a better, relatively speaking, life in the past 2 years. So Scott, for that, we thank you. And enough for me. Please welcome Dr. Scott Atlas.
Thank you. That was a really nice introduction. Is my presentation mode?
So they only see the president. You can see both, but they'll only see the.
Okay. Yes, good. Okay, beautiful. Well, thank you. Well, as we know, I mean, there's nothing more complicated these days than the pandemic and its management and how it's impacted everything. I sort of think of it that the pandemic exposed a lot of things that were probably already there, leaving us with some serious issues to grapple with on how to proceed as a free country. And I start off, I'm going to go through a lot of data, because I think the only way to understand what should have been done and what should be done in future and how everything sort of unraveled is to really understand the data. And in fact, most of the data has either been invisible, censored, distorted. What happened? Why do I not see my slides? I don't see my slides. Should I? Okay. So I like to also, for those who disagree with what was done in the prevailing narrative, it's critical to, if you're going to argue, which is sort of futile these days, you have to know the data. It's not, otherwise it's just an assertion, which of course doesn't hold any water. So what happens is actually the first words I said to my wife when I walked off the plane. It left DC. What happened? And I was sort of talking about me because the whole thing was surreal. But what happened was that the country was given a certain narrative that it locked in on very rapidly, and it was a lot of it was fear, and that was started by the World Health Organization, who said that the fatality rate was exceptionally high compared to anything else we had seen. And the modelers amplified this. These are people who had been gross failures in their previous computer models of pandemics. Yet they went forward and they made very bizarre assumptions that were against fundamental biology, but somehow they were amplified by the public health leaders and the media. And the social media, and this is one of the problems, is that we are in a world for the first time where the social media is present in a healthcare crisis like this. And it was very, very harmful. That all happened by the spring of 2020. And what was claimed was that the virus had a far higher fatality rate than influenza by several orders of magnitude, that everyone had a significant risk to die and no one had immunity because the virus was new, that everyone was dangerous, everyone spreads the infection, asymptomatic people drive the spread of the infection, locking down would stop and even eliminate the virus, masks would protect everyone and stop the spread of the virus, and immune protection can only be obtained from a vaccine. And every one of these things is completely false. And it was known to be false in the spring of 2020, which was when I started writing about the pandemic, and then went to DC, by the way, end of July, beginning of August. So the pandemic team, the coronavirus task force, was in place for 5 to 6 months before I even walked in. Their policy was, as we heard Dr. Burke say, flatten the curve. And that was very rational. Flatten the curve meant decrease the spread rapidity so that the hospitals would not get overwhelmed. So we could treat not just the COVID patients, but people with serious illnesses. And that made a lot of sense if you could do that. It also would give some time to develop and produce the equipment that was needed to get doctors and medical personnel where it would be needed, et cetera. But somehow that rapidly changed into some process called stop COVID-19 cases at all costs. And then by March of 2020 is when it started and then throughout the whole year, the two heads of the medical federal policy were Drs. Burke, the head of the task force medical side, the task force coordinator, and Dr. Spouchy, who was the most influential leader of the federal guidance, even though he really wasn't in charge of anything formally as I came to know. And they wanted and advised the lockdowns. And what they did was they advised school closures, business closures and restrictions, curfews, quarantines of asymptomatic people, and a host of other mandates. And their policy was implemented by the governors throughout most of the country. And I call that the Burke-Spouchy lockdowns, because that's what they were. And what the result was about 900,000 plus Americans have died, at least have been deaths attributed to COVID. And millions of families and children were severely harmed, especially the working class and the poor. That's what was implemented. They got what they wanted. So they own the outcomes. The lockdowners own the outcomes. No matter how Orwellian we hear people go in front of the media or even testify to the House of Representatives subcommittee investigating the pandemic, which Dr. Burke did, claiming that the problem was the people who disagreed with what was implemented. But we know disagreeing with what was implemented and being blamed for the failure of what was implemented is it doesn't make sense. This is the results, COVID deaths in the United States per million under the Fauci policy. And I call it the Fauci policy because during the change of administration on January 20th, he then formally became the head of the COVID management policy. And this is a graph of COVID deaths per million, the US and our peer nations of Western Europe. And this, you could see, that's the US. That's the results of the Fauci policy. It's not an opinion, this is just the fact of how many people died under that policy. The data is flawed, and this is the problem. From the get-go, the PCR testing, the determination of who was infectious from the PCR testing, the timelines and trends, and in fact, the whole categorization of hospitalizations and deaths from COVID. This is an article published in the spring of 2021 that talked about the technical issue that's important about testing. And that is, if you're using PCR testing, there's something called cycle thresholds, which is the number of times you have to average the test to detect the virus or the fragment of the virus. And if you're using a high one, that means there's not much virus material around. At a cycle threshold of 35, 97% of cultures are false positives. There's virus material there, but these people are not contagious. It's either dead or so minimal they're not contagious. 97%. That number, 35 cycle thresholds, was even lower than what was used in the UK, the US, and Israel. So you have 97+% of positive PCR tests are showing non-contagious people. Therefore, if you're quarantining people and testing the people who they've been exposed to on the basis of positive PCR, you're making a huge mistake. I presented the data on the task force. They didn't acknowledge it. They didn't know it. They never talked about it. They just disregarded it and said I was an outlier. It turned out that right before I got there was one person who knew. At a cycle threshold of 35 or more, he said the chances of it being replication competent, meaning contagious, are minuscule. You got to say it's just dead nucleotides. That was said by Anthony Spouchy in July of 2020. That was disregarded the rest of the time. Hospitalizations from COVID-19. This is a huge error. The quantification is wrong. Why do I say that? It's proven wrong. This is a study from Stanford, the pediatric hospital there, that did a chart review retrospectively of the people that were hospitalized for COVID. Almost half had no symptoms of COVID because every patient tested for the virus. They're test positive, but they were hospitalized for something else. I mean, 0 symptoms of COVID, not just mild or moderate COVID, 0 symptoms. They were hospitalized for being sick with something else. Appendicitis, head trauma, multiple broken bones. But they had a positive SARS positive test. Therefore, they were categorized as COVID hospitalizations, and that was wrong. This is a big hospital complex in California. 86% of patients hospitalized with COVID, quote unquote, did not have COVID. So there's a gross exaggeration, particularly in the pediatric side, of the numbers you're reading of how many actually had COVID. What about deaths from COVID? It's the same sort of problem. This is CDC data. And they're saying here that if you're under 18, 35% of people that were called dead from COVID, quote, could not plausibly be attributable to COVID on a retrospective review. There's a gross exaggeration of hospitalizations and deaths from COVID in the United States. It doesn't mean that people didn't die. I'm not minimizing COVID, but this is the perspective that was never given to the American public. There's another perspective. Who's at risk? We knew from the beginning that the World Health Organization estimate of 3.4% fatality rate was grossly wrong. After about 10 minutes, you saw that the denominator of the fraction was based on whoever was super sick, that was sick enough to come to the hospital. That's not how you calculate an infection fatality rate. It's all those who are infected. And so the data ended up showing that if you're under 70, the infection fatality rate is 0.05. This has repeatedly been done under 70. And that is the same order of magnitude as influenza for people under 70. Age is the most important risk for COVID death. The mean age of death is 80. For some perspective, if you're under 20, your risk of dying is thousands-fold less than if you're old. And in various countries, most countries, in fact, in the Western world, the median age of death of COVID patients is older than the life expectancy. It doesn't mean people didn't die. And it's very serious that the older people die. But it's not a disease that everyone is in danger of. It turns out it's not just age. 2/3 of deaths in the United States were in people who had greater than or equal to 6 comorbidities. Not just one. I came into the task force and showed the data on comorbidities. They had no idea what I was talking about. If you have, the data showed high blood pressure alone is not a risk factor. But their retort was, oh, there's so many people with high blood pressure. But those people are not at high risk. That's what the epidemiologic data show. This was known since 2020. The risk to and from children is, of course, very important. And it turns out that while a significant percentage of patients or kids get the infection, in California it's about 14%, 0% die. It doesn't mean zero, not absolute numerically zero, but it rounds to 0% of COVID deaths are in children in California. For perspective, in influenza a couple years ago, 5.4% of deaths were in kids. This is 0%. This is the case fatality rate, meaning of the people who are sick enough to go to see a doctor, what percent die? In Florida, 0% case fatality rate if you're under 16, 0% if you're under 30 in Florida. That's the case fatality rate. Not only is the risk to healthy children extremely low, but the risk of spread from children is low. This is data known in the spring and summer of 2020. This is not new. None of what I've said so far is new knowledge. It wasn't learned over the past 6 months or a year or two. Or a year and a half. It's 2020, spring, summer. Iceland proved by a very sophisticated disease transmission molecular study with contact tracing, not a regular contact tracing study. They didn't even have a single instance of a child infecting parents. There were studies from more than a dozen countries in Europe that showed no significant spread of kids in schools. The data showed clearly schools were not associated, open schools were not associated with spread of the cases. In fact, the risk in these studies for teachers of COVID was the same or less than the community. There was no special risk for teachers. In fact, if I were designing a job that I wanted to be safe from COVID, I'd want to be an elementary school teacher. It's a complete lie that the schools have to be closed or there's some special equipment needed in schools to protect teachers. It's just not true. The bottom line is healthy children have extremely low risk of serious illness from COVID, almost no risk of death. Children infrequently spread the virus to adults, and there was no special risk to teachers. The first thing I did when I went to Washington was I said, okay, what's the most important thing I could advocate for? I was an advisor, I had no authority, of course. But I said, okay, let's open the schools. Because I got there in the beginning of August. My first task force meeting was the 2nd week of August. Europe was opening schools. We were the only country in the sort of our peer nations that closed our schools in the fall of 2020. The only one. Almost every Western European country knew the data and they opened the schools. And yet there was a tremendous amount of momentum here of closing schools. And they had already closed schools in the spring. But the reality is, because healthy children do not have a significant risk from the virus, the harms of closing in-person schools are enormous. We knew that then. And to me, there was nothing more important to a civilized society than educating its children. So this was a no-brainer, I thought. We knew from the spring, the data already had shown that online learning was a failure. F grades were exploding. This is true. And it wasn't just lack of broadband. That's a mistake to say that. The country with the most penetrance of broadband in homes is the Netherlands. They had a serious drop of learning, even in those homes, because we all know, anyone who's a parent understands, you learn a lot in school that is not just from the book, right? You learn socialization, you have a group effort, you do projects, you learn how to work with other people. There's all kinds of things that contribute to your learning. Stanford Education Center published a study, and the first sentence of their conclusion was the findings on learning losses are chilling from school closures. We also know that all these losses are far greater for minorities and poor people. Okay, you don't have to be a genius to figure that out. And so the disparities that everyone is concerned with in education were made worse. Not everyone lives in Palo Alto, or Austin maybe is like that. In my neighborhood, all the parents were getting together and had their PhD neighbors going to these micro schools, and the schools were better. This all goes into this sort of very heinous social warfare really that was done with the pandemic management. I always like to say the lockdowns were a luxury of the rich. Okay, in places like Palo Alto, I'll just pick on where I live, no one was really significantly harmed by the lockdowns. It was an inconvenience, but that's not what most people are. And we know that many schools, many parents, many families detect hearing and vision impairment. Nutrition is met at schools. They learn physical activity as their only outlet. You know, there's a lot of things in schools that are irreplaceable by online learning. Now, there's a massive harm, though, that is directly done to the younger generation in the United States. This is a graph showing that for teenagers, medical visits went down during the lockdown of 2020 compared to the previous year for all medical care. And that's because people were afraid to go in, people didn't go to get care, the hospitals were literally closed for most care. And that's insurance medical claims over the year. This is psychiatric disease claims in teenagers. It exploded year to year. This is 2020 versus 2019 throughout the lockdown. This is a double to triple increase in the visits to doctors for self-harm in teenagers. This is kids putting out cigarettes on their skin or slashing their wrists. Just during the lockdown. This is not from the virus, it's from the lockdown. This is an explosion of psychiatric illness in college students. Anxiety disorder, depression, everything is above 0%. 0 would be equal to 1, no percent increase compared to the previous year. Explosion in college age students. Explosion in drug abuse in teenagers and substance use disorders. So many things to go there. I won't bother with all of them, but suffice it to say that in the June 2020 data, just after the spring isolations from school, there was 25% of college-age people in the United States that are killing themselves from the isolation. That's not from the virus. Mandela said there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul in the way in which it treats its children, and the United States completely failed. Now, what is lockdown? And I'm saying this because one of the meetings, not task force, one of the other meetings, this is by beginning of October. We were in a meeting, a working meeting, and Dr. Burke, I was the only one talking about the harms of the policy. And Dr. Burke said, Scott, no one on the task force is for lockdown. Because by then, lockdown was a dirty word. I was making the case that all the harms of the lockdowns. They never mentioned lockdown, 0. And she said, no one's for the lockdown. And so I said, well, are you for closing of schools and businesses? Yes. Are you for limiting medical care from non-COVID illness? Yes. Are you for limiting groups and families? Yes. Are you for quarantining asymptomatic people? Yes. Are you for curfews? Yes. I said, that's the lockdown. I mean, this is, the tip of the iceberg, by the way, of the frustration. The lockdowns failed. This is the data. Okay, this is not an opinion. I'm going to cite the studies here and show the studies. Bjornskog, March 2021, compared to mortality in 24 European countries. The lockdown policies has not been associated with lower mortality. The lockdowns have not worked as intended. This is January 2021 from Stanford. The lockdowns, we did not find significant benefits on case growth of the more severe lockdowns. So they didn't stop the dying, they didn't stop the case growth. They didn't reduce the case growth. This is a great study from Rand Institute and USC, June 2021, National Bureau of Economic Research. They looked at 43 countries and in the US also. The lockdowns led to an increase in excess deaths. That's beyond a non-pandemic year. Longer lockdowns, more excess deaths. Earlier lockdowns instituted more excess deaths. In fact, in the 43 countries with available data and in the US, the excess deaths were already going down, the lockdowns were instituted, and the deaths started going up. And then the most recent study is from a group at Hopkins in January of this year, who did a meta-analysis, and they showed the bottom line here is lockdown policies are ill-founded and should be rejected as a pandemic policy in this country. And the irony of the whole thing is this also is not news. The standard pandemic management from the first decade of the 2000s was lockdowns don't work and they're harmful. It should not be instituted. This was known. Why did the public believe in lockdowns? Because I think this is really getting into how did this happen? Because there were two lies, two false dichotomies put forward. One was if you're against lockdowns, you're choosing the economy over lives. This was the first thing said. Because when President Trump said, open up, we're going to destroy the economy, the reaction was, you're choosing the economy over lives. The reality, of course, was that there's, as everyone here knows more than I do, decades of literature on a severe economic downturn killing people. It was lives versus lives. It wasn't economy versus lives. And the second lie was if you're against lockdowns, you're for allowing the infection to spread without mitigation. This is the so-called radioactive term, herd immunity strategy, which of course I personally never advised. I never heard anyone in the White House advise the president or even mention letting the virus spread without mitigation. That was a lie picked up on, started by the Washington Post, frankly, and then picked up on by everybody. I work at Stanford and Hoover, and as Tom and most people know, there's a lot of good economists there. There wasn't a single one who wanted to write about the disastrous impact on health of the lockdowns from economic downturn. And so I was called up and published a paper in May of 2020. I was called up by an economist at the University of Chicago. He said, Scott, you're writing about the lockdowns. Let's quantify, because this translates into deaths. It's not the economy. And we did, and we showed in May of 2020 that at that point in time, the number of life years lost was double from the lockdown. Being very conservative, I didn't even include most of the medical care that was going on and not being used. Going to double the number of life years lost compared to the life years lost from the virus. There was a massive amount of harm. How could that be? Well, first of all, the medical care. I mean, half of the 650,000 US cancer patients by spring stopped going to their chemo. And the cancer was still there. They were on chemo already. They just said, I'm not going in, I'm afraid to go into a medical facility. This was directly from the wording of the media and the people in the task force. Half of stroke and heart attack patients did not call an ambulance. Organ transplants were down 85% from the previous year. 2/3 to 3/4 of cancer screenings were skipped. Most childhood vaccinations were skipped, ironically. During the first 2 months of the pandemic in 2020, more than 1/3 of the excess deaths in the United States were not due to COVID. They were lockdown deaths. When I say lockdowns are a luxury of the rich, everyone here knows this. This is the chart of the year of 2020 on job growth. And what they call high income jobs, they actually went up during the lockdown. Low income jobs down 23.6%. Not only did we destroy their children and their families, but economically, these people were destroyed. When the US locks down, it impacts the world. Not just though because of the economic commingling of all the economies, but because when the US public health leadership speaks, the rest of the world, there's a lot of credibility. And so we also interrupted the supply chain directly. Why does that matter? Well, 400,000 new people died from tuberculosis in the first year of the lockdown because of the supply chain and the lack of care for these people. Tens of thousands of additional malaria deaths in babies occurred. They couldn't get the malaria deaths. These are very simple solutions that were interrupted, these poor countries. More than 100 million more children were exposed all over the world to sexual abuse and exploitation, violence, genital mutilation, and childhood pregnancy. Okay? Lockdowns were clearly a luxury of the rich. When you have a poor country, and I'm sure everyone here knows that when the GDP drops in a poor country, million more people in 2020 went into extreme poverty compared to the previous year. That's a World Bank estimate. Okay, 30 million people in India alone went from middle class to poverty because of the lockdowns. This was a study looking at the worldwide harms in 124 countries, and just to say that 1.2 billion quality life years in their paper were lost due to the lockdowns, 25 times as many life years lost due to the virus. So lockdowns failed. They failed to protect the elderly from dying. They failed to stop the virus. They killed families. They destroyed children, especially low income and poor, while sparing the affluent. To use an overused phrase, that's the science. Okay, there was an alternative, and this is the issue here. There was an alternative. It's not true there was nothing else. And that was what I called targeted protection. It was first described by John Ioannidis in March of 2020 during this pandemic. Of course, that is what should be used in all pandemics. He wrote about it. David Katz wrote about it in the New York Times, and I wrote about it and couldn't get my paper, by the way, into the Wall Street Journal. They rejected it and said, so this is all known, everybody's saying this. Okay, this is March of 2020. And I thought it was urgent to get this information out. So I sent it to the place where I thought I could get it published right away after that, which was the Washington Times. And that's where the article is. I didn't know about Martin Kulldorff, a Harvard epidemiologist, was also trying to get his papers published. He couldn't get it published in the country. So he had his papers talking about targeted protection published in Sweden and CNN Espanol. CNN English would not publish the paper though. And that targeted protection didn't mean let the virus spread. It meant increase the protection of the high-risk group, the people who actually have a risk to die, and stop the destruction of everything else because you're killing them. And then several others later in spring and summer started writing about this, and eventually 6 months or 7 months later,
Something else is going to kill us.
at least that's something we can't control.
Silence doesn't work.
So in October, the Great Barrington Declaration was written by Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford and Sunetra Gupta of Oxford. And they called for what they called focused protection, which is basically the same thing. Now, how did targeted protection work? Meaning, what are the results? Because that's what counts. Because the burden is on the places that did lockdown to be better, because they had also a massive amount of collateral damage compared to places that didn't do lockdowns. And so we have our internal control, relatively speaking. After the first lockdown, DeSantis opened up Florida. And very early in 2020, in August, he opened everything, including schools. And so we look at what happened. Just to start by saying, Florida's at a disadvantage. Okay? Florida is one of the oldest states by median age in the country. It's the 5th oldest state. I'm also highlighting California, my state, which is the 6th youngest state by median age. And so we know that there's an advantage. We're talking about a disease that kills old people, basically. We also can look at how old the state is by percent of people over 65. Florida is the oldest state in that way. California is way down here. And I'm picking California and Florida to illustrate because they're sort of similar states. They're big, heterogeneous economically, heterogeneous industry-wise, heterogeneous urban, rural, population heterogeneity, somewhat similar weather, although Tom knows the weather in California is better than Florida. But what did we look at after 1 year? Let's look at the first year. Here's the data. COVID deaths per capita, Florida outperformed the country in 25 states. Excess mortality increased, which means all deaths, whether it's due to COVID or not. And of course, that's relevant because it's hard to categorize what's real COVID, but we know when people died. So excess mortality increased. Florida outperformed the United States, and Florida outperformed the United States and 40 states in age-adjusted COVID mortality, which is the way to compare COVID mortality. What about specifically Florida versus California? Well, this, first of all, is a graph showing green from September 2020 or late summer is schools open in person. This is Florida. Here's the little sliver of schools open in California, where during that year, at the most, 17% of California students had in-person school. So that was one clear difference, and we know that's very harmful to keep schools closed. But what about the statistics? Okay, Florida outperformed California after the first full year in age-adjusted COVID mortality. Florida outperformed California. The burdens on California to do better because it destroyed everybody. Then what happened in the summer of 2021 was that cases were sort of exploding in the South again. You guys probably remember this. And the media was sort of giddy about this because they want Florida to fail. And so they're saying, look at all the cases, this yellow and high sort of whitish areas are high cases per capita per 100,000. And dark is very low case. I say, oh, look what's happening though, the cases are coming back. This is when I was writing my book. And I said, okay, and I put it in there. I said, well, but what's going to happen almost certainly is the cases are going to go down like they do everywhere else. And no matter what you do, and the cases are going to go up in the rest of the country. And then in the fall, that's exactly what happened. The cases started coming down in Florida and the South and going up throughout the rest of the country. But that wasn't because I knew something. It was because I can read. And I knew that the year before, that's exactly what happened. In the summer of 2020, the cases were in Texas and Florida and the South. And then they went down there, and then they went up in the rest of the country 3 months later. This was known. This was not sort of something that was that complicated. Let's look at the whole pandemic. And this is the latest slides I have. Excess mortality, Florida versus California. California ranked 34th, 18.6% excess mortality increase. Florida, 15.6% excess mortality increase and ranked 19th best and better than the United States average. This is, by the way, Florida versus New York. New York, 19%, Florida, 15.6% increase in excess mortality. New York ranked 35th, Florida 19th, USA 17%. You're never going to hear that on CNN. Of course, I'm not sure how many people are listening to CNN. Suffrage. States after the summer surge, age-adjusted COVID mortality, Florida is circled here, beat about 60% of the states this is through the whole pandemic. What about vaccines? Okay, this was the first study that was important from Israel. And I'm going to show you a lot of data from studies that were not US, because at this point, it's very sad to say, but I don't really trust the data from the CDC. So I look at the other countries. And I look at Israel. And Israel showed in 2021 that the case protection, the efficiency of the vaccine was only 39% after about 5 months. So it wasn't very protective. The protection waned after 4 or 5 months, but it was very high against severe disease, hospitalization or death, over roughly 90%, which is very good. And the reason this data is important is because there's so much sort of distortion and backlash against the inappropriate mandates for taking a vaccine for people who don't necessarily need them, and a lack of transparency about the side effects of the vaccines, that there's an excessively negative, in my view of the vaccines, because the vaccines actually protect people against dying if you have a high risk of death so far. This is Qatar, and you think, well, why would I look at Qatar for an honest data? Well, they actually vaccinate almost everybody. And it was one of the countries that did this right away. This is October 2021, New England Journal. And their data showed that the effectiveness against getting any viral infection, whether symptomatic or not, mild or asymptomatic, waned down to really negligible, which means 20% effective after 4 months. That's not good protection against an infection, but it was very protective against dying through the whole length of the study. 6 months out, still 90% effective against death. This is just the error bars are so big because there's so few cases, obviously. So we just talk about where there's a reasonable number of cases, very high protection against death. That's the Qatar data. What about Sweden? This is a study from end of October. And they also showed that the effectiveness against an infection, in this case symptomatic infection, waned significantly after about 5 or 6 months. But the hospitalization or death from after being vaccinated was still very high after 6 to 9 months if you're under 80. that I separated their data out. They don't have this chart in the paper. This is their data. This is people under 80. If you're over 80, it's starting to drop after about 6 months. It's still reasonable. It's not bad. You have to realize that most of the people who die from influenza, the older people who are sick in influenza season, most of them have been vaccinated. The vaccines are not 100% protected. That's not the realistic expectation anyway. So this kind of number is very good against protecting against death. This is the data on COVID vaccines later in Israel, end of summer 2021, where they looked at this issue of what's the immune protection if you've been infected but never vaccinated. Okay, this is something the United States is uniquely denying the reality of this compared to other countries. Against symptomatic infection, the post-infection recovered people have a superior protection against another infection compared to post-vaccinated, never infected people by 27-fold. By 13-fold, better protection against any infection. That was against symptomatic infection. And against hospitalization by 8-fold. People who recovered from COVID but never vaccinated have superior protection than people who've been vaccinated but never infected. And they looked at people who were recovered from the infection but never vaccinated and compared them to people who recovered but then vaccinated. And there was no statistical difference. There was no benefit in their study to getting vaccinated if you already have COVID. That's not an opinion, that's their data. Then they did a follow-up study and they showed that there were 3 groups: protection against any new infection, the statistically significant, no difference, statistical significant difference between the protection against a new infection of those who've recovered but never vaccinated versus those who've recovered and then been vaccinated versus those who've been vaccinated and then gotten infected. It turns out for a second infection. No difference. There's no value in their study of people getting a vaccine if you've had COVID. And in fact, all 3 groups had better protection than those who've been vaccinated but never infected. So anyone who's been infected, whether you've been vaccinated or not, gives superior protection to people who've been vaccinated but never infected. And they showed the same thing against severe disease. No benefit to getting vaccinated if you had the infection, whether your vaccine comes before or after. This is just the actual graphed out data. There's with the increasing infection in people, rates of infection in people who've been vaccinated but never infected compared to the groups of people who've been infected in the past with or without vaccine. This is the data on Omicron. This is Denmark from the end of December of 2021. And it showed that whether Pfizer or Moderna was the vaccine in question, with Omicron, after 2 months, there was a 4 to 9% effectiveness of getting infection. So essentially 0. That vaccine, these vaccines would never have been approved if that was the data. This is the data from New York more recently, February 28th of this year, that showed the same kind of thing, a very poor protection against Omicron of the vaccines after just 2 months. Now, what was shocking wasn't so much that as much as this. This is an advisor to the FDA on vaccine approval in children. The editor-in-chief of the New England Journal in October said, but we're never going to learn how safe the vaccine is unless we start giving it. That's just the way it goes. Okay, but that's not something you would expect in the United States. That violates all standards of medical ethics. Other countries didn't do that. The Scandinavian countries still, most of them don't recommend the vaccine for people in their teens or under 20. This is UK's advisory committee to the NHS. And they said the margin of benefit is too small to support advising vaccination of healthy 12 to 15-year-olds. We were the outlier, trying to mandate, enforce, or impose vaccines. So the data on the vaccines is they protect well against death and severe disease for those with a significant risk. Their protection against infection diminishes after 4 to 6 months and becomes nearly 0 after 2 months against Omicron. They do not protect against infection as well as or as long as the immunity in recovered patients. They cannot generate herd immunity, which was the goal of the vaccine, there are serious safety concerns, and there's been a complete lack of transparency about them. For instance, the incidence of myocarditis from the vaccine in young males is estimated to be 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 8,000, which is very high. And we're still not able to see all the data, although from FOIA requests, the data on Pfizer's trials is finally coming out. But there is no safety data on multiple vaccine injections and boosters. The data that was presented to the FDA, because after I had left, was from Israel on boosters, and they used safety data of 30 days. Okay, that's not safety data. Vaccine safety data typically is 5 years. I mean, emergency situation, okay, it was short. But here we're talking about boosters in children. The whole thing is just out of whack. There is a serious breakdown of medical ethics to anyone who recommends and administers vaccines to healthy children and young people. I don't even understand how the human subjects get into the universities that are doing the trials, because the kids who are healthy have no significant risk from the disease. You don't inject experimental drugs in them. The part of the problem that the public's perception is the media, of course. And the media is uniquely poisonous in the United States. This is a study from National Bureau of Economic Research toward the end of 2020 that quantified negative stories versus positive stories about COVID. And in the English-speaking non-US media, just over half the stories about COVID were quantifiably negative. In the United States, 91%, same time frame, were negative. Same deal with the schools. Slightly more than half of English-speaking non-US media were quantified as negative about schools reopening. US media, 90 to 10, quantifiably negative stories. In the United States during 2020, the stories about increasing COVID cases outnumbered the stories about decreasing COVID cases by 5.5 to 1, even when the cases were going down. That's what was happening. The result is we have a damaged younger generation. This is the health consequence assessment by people in their own age bracket to their age bracket. And we can see that the fear, the exaggerated danger in young people compared to the actual danger of mortality is out of whack. But equivalent assessment of danger in older people have a very high risk of dying. About half of people in a YouGov survey, 18 to 24, 50%, said they were nervous about all social interactions in the United States. Weight gain during the lockdown. Okay, a lot of people gained weight during the lockdown. Every age group did, but it's the 18 to 24-year-old that gained the most weight. 52% of people college age in the United States had a weight gain unwanted, and that averaged 28 pounds. That's not 5 pounds. That's not cosmetic. That's obesity. So now they have a high risk even from COVID. Ironically. I want to talk about university censorship because this is one of the problems that we knew there was a bias on university campuses. I don't think I have to tell anybody at any university campus that. My particular university was a disgrace during COVID. And how do I know that? Well, this is 3 medical scientists at Stanford, Johnny Anides, myself, and Jay Bhattacharya. We said the exact same thing about who's at risk, about the low risk to children, about the protection from recovered patients, about the ineffective masks when they're used widely. We all said the schools were safe and should be open. We said lockdown should not be used, and we advocated for COVID protection. We all said almost the exact same thing. In fact, I talked to Johnny Anides almost every day during 2020, and Jay Bhattacharya, and after I went into the White House, I was talking to Jay Bhattacharya every day just to regain my sanity, not to go over the data. We all said the exact same thing, but only one got a Stanford University censure. I wonder why. Okay, why? Because I had the audacity to try to help the country under a president that the Stanford University faculty despised. Why do I say they despised him? Well, California voting record 2-1 Biden to Trump. Stanford has its own zip code. And everybody who lives in that zip code is basically a faculty member of Stanford. And the voting record is 94.7% for Biden, 3.5% for Trump. After the medical school posted this censure, and actually on Stanford email servers, advocated for other faculty to write slanderous opinion pieces about me. Only one medical scientist stood up and defended it, and that was Martin Kulldorff of Harvard. He wrote into the Stanford Daily, and he said, I would be delighted to debate the issues with any of the 98 signatories. How many took him up on the challenge? 0. Here's the problem. We have lost trust in the United States in all of our institutions. This is what we are left with. We're not just left with the toll of COVID, of the psychological damage and the other damage to young people. We're left with a country that cannot trust the public health agencies, the university leadership, doctors. Science has been politicized. This is a complete disaster. The free exchange of ideas that are necessary to solve all problems, in fact, that are fundamental to any free society, is under threat in this country. The first step in restoring trust is for the lockdowners to admit their error. Okay, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but as we know, anyone who's married, the first thing you do is say, I'm sorry. It goes a long way, but this is more serious than that, of course. I'm joking about that. People need to understand that what was done was wrong, and it was wrong from the get-go. We knew it was wrong. It was known, and it wasn't just, by the way, suppression of free speech. There was denial of fact in the United States, and it's still going on today. What am I doing about it? Well, I am a co-founding fellow of a new institute, the Academy for Science and Freedom, with Dr. Kulldorff and Dr. Bhattacharya, under the guidance and under the umbrella with support from Larry Arnn, the president of Yale College. Because we need leaders who have courage. I mean, you know, I wrote a book 30 years ago called MRI of the Brain and Spine. And I knew a lot of people didn't have a brain, but I never understood how few had a spine. And Larry Arnn has a spine. And what we need to do, and what we're doing, we just had that event in Washington, D.C. actually on Friday, is we need to educate the public about what happened. And we need to solve how to take the politics and the censorship out of science.
This is a tornado warning. Please shelter immediately.
That's not censorship.
No.
You know, one of the issues with science that people don't understand, for instance, is there is a cartel that funds all the research in the United States. The NIH controls all the most significant research funding. And by doing that, they also control every academic scientist's career. You can't be an assistant professor and feel like you can speak out against the NIH when you need the grants to have a promotion. I mean, and they also control, the same people, the review of the papers that are published in the most journals. So there's this very unhealthy relationship between the funding of science, public policy, the control of careers of scientists, and pharma as part of this ingredient. This needs to be solved. It needs to be fixed. So to finish up here, this is a picture of the newspaper in Italy, the main newspaper, that says the church, after 359 years, admitted that the earth moved, that Galileo was right. I don't think the lockdowners are going to be in here for less than 359 years before they admit they were wrong. So to finish, Churchill said, truth is incontrovertible, panic may resent it, ignorance may deride it, malice may distort it, but there it is. And the earth is wrong. Okay.